And welcome to Warrior. Software may decide who wins the next war, is a comment I heard from a senior Pentagon weapons developer. It's not lost on the Army. They brought on one of the top cyber AI and technology experts in existence, Mr. Young Bang. He's right here with us. It's amazing. He's the principal deputy to the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. Sir, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm super looking forward to the discussion.
So much going on with AI and software and cyber. Your expertise, gosh, by so many estimations. Let's start with this AI 100-day risk plan. That, from what I understand, there's a new initiative to really better secure AI and kind of develop a bit of a technical roadmap for how it can inform and improve weapon systems and decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. So, really, a couple things there. One thing is that we've published a 100-day AI implementation plan for ASALT in the Army, and that really sets the conditions for AI. And subsequent to the 100-day implementation plan will be a 500-day implementation plan, right? So we set the conditions for with the 100-day, and with the 500-day, we're going to operationalize that. And subsequent to that, we are the first service that actually has palmed a program of record for artificial intelligence. So that's how things line up. As a component of our 100-day implementation plan, we have what's called the AI layered defense framework. And the very long descriptive title, but on social media, it's going to be Defend AI. And just like it sounds, it's really a notion of how do we help industry adopt third-party generated algorithms faster? So if we develop algorithms or we ask industry to come into our trusted and secure environment with our data sets, there's a process for that, right? But one of the things that we want to do is recognize that industry is going to be far better than the Army or DoD at developing really amazing algorithms. And so what we want to do is be able to adopt that faster. And to enable that, just like with our software directive, there's been obstacles along the way at the enterprise level. And so what we want to do is tackle the big obstacles like the adoption and how do we accelerate that head on. And so this AI layered defense framework enables us to really think through what are the risks and how do we go through a layered defense through controls, right, that we automate so that we can actually identify our known risk, and just like everything else on the commercial side or within the government, make a risk-based decision to put it onto a closed system, put it onto a business system, put it into a weapon system, and if it's a weapon system, is it safety critical or airworthiness or actually firing life and death type of scenario. And so we think that this framework will give us the ability to address those obstacles, work with industry, and then adopt the third-party generated algorithms faster.
Excellent. Well, gosh, I read that not long ago, Secretary Wormuth came up with a human machine interface directive, which seems to align with this. And it sets up really a question so many have that you touched on, sir. This idea of how AI can become more reliable. I guess the term is zero trust. What are some of the efforts underway to ensure that machine algorithms can be trusted and that they bounce something off a database, perform the analytics, that it's reliable in real time in a way that it would need to be? Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge question that I think everyone in the industry as well as the government are addressing, right? So I think that the government has been really particular about putting the notion about a responsible AI around, well, ethics on the government side, and the DoD has been very particular about responsible AI. A component about responsible AI is around trust. And for us in the Army and the DoD side, we want to trust, but not rely just on trust. So it's going to be a trust but verify process. And that way enable us to get to what you were talking about. How do we get algorithms in there that enable us to do things much more faster, efficiently, right? And give our soldiers and warfighters more bandwidth so they're not doing menial tasks, so they could actually do higher performing tasks. Now, there is a dimension of what you just talked about. How do we get something so we can, quote, trust it so we can actually be deployed into our systems? Human-machine interface is one of them. So we are working on human-machine interface formations and figuring out how and what formations, what automation or algorithms or a combination of both can enable us and experiment those concepts together while we're actually figuring out how we actually build in the trust component. And right now, I think the DoD has been pretty adamant about making sure there's a human in the loop or on the loop. So it's not totally automated, so we don't have the whole singularity and the whole Terminator thing in the scenario. But we're putting in safeguards to enable as much as possible the framework so we could get to trust, but then also experimenting right now with the concepts of human and machines and interactions. We just finished up a series of experimentations a la Project Convergence, where one component was with our allies and our partners, and one component was a little bit more closed that was really testing out the HMIF concepts a little bit more. Lots of valuable lessons observed from there, and we're further fleshing out our concepts of how to employ algorithms better and safer in a trusted environment.
Excellent, sir. Well, gosh, one of the things that calls to mind is this question of reliability. And not long ago, I heard President Obama, former president, on CNN. He was talking about AI. He was praising its merits, but then he also touched on something you mentioned, which is this optimal need to connect both human consciousness and AI to capture what's best from each. And one of the things he said, I'd love to give a speech as a liberal arts guy about consciousness and how intuition can't be replicated by computers and all of that. But he said it way better than I ever could. He just said computers can't feel joy. So what happens when you get to the point that AI reaches some of its technological limits? You've got to have that synergy with human decision making, correct? And then what's the path forward with something like that?
Yeah, I think that's a great topic that you teed up. In the Army and in the DoD and the military side, we have what we call leadership. It's an art and a science. And for us, right, we want to enable a lot of the science to really accelerate at speed, whether it's the data, the visioning, the fusion of data, so we could get insights to enable the leader or the commander to make decisions based on military experience, right? And so there's a dimension of processing everything, the data. But the leaders don't need all the data. They just need some insights to really help them have data points so they can make judgments and decisions to really the art of the war, right? And so the way we're looking at it right now, until technology matures enough to get closer to AGI, we're not there. Gen AI has done a lot to help us, but really we're still far from AGI. And so what we're looking at is, how do we combine the two, the art and the science? How do we enable the AI or the Gen AI to give insights for the leader to make the decisions? And then at the point, somewhere in the future, as we get closer to AGI, I think we'll address those type of things through experimentations, through concepts, exploration, and working with industry.
Want to ask you about a couple other things, but gosh, to be real technical for a minute, I'd love your thought on this. Some experts were talking to me about how algorithms can be spoofed. For example, a sensor could determine a tank was in the trees below with enemy, but that an enemy would then put a poster over the tank. And so that in a way to spoof the spoofer, essentially counter the countermeasure, algorithms can be trained to look at a host of different variables. Maybe there's a thermal signature, maybe it's vegetation, maybe there are other indicators to give you that false negative or that false positive so you can overcome the spoof. How is AI being hardened to kind of deal with some of these kinds of impediments, and does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense. And so there's a lot of thoughts about AI. There's concepts that we're pushing around counter AI. And then I've been pushing those even more to say, well, we need to have counter to the counter AI, right? And if you boil that down to layman's term, we're really talking about resilient AI, right? That's a lot harder concept to get to, but we are pushing the envelope around AI, and counter to counter AI. Now, to the point that you talked about, some of the things that I talked about earlier, the defend AI component of things will help us kind of protect and get a little bit better. But the whole notion that you talked about spoofing, yeah, we think we know for a fact that's real. And part of the examples that you gave was also why, modeling simulations and synthetic data for us aren't as good, right? Or won't be as practicable, or isn't quite as mature for our uses than it is for the consumer side, right? So we use the example of self-driving cars as an example. lots of great technology and advances there, right? But to do that in a combat environment where there's no roads, there's no signals, there's no, stop signs and traffic cones that you can categorize and classify easily becomes a lot harder. And so we recognize the difficulty of that as well as the spoofing element. And we are thinking about that. We are looking at how GANs, right? So GANs are very popular in deepfakes, but we're looking at how do we apply GANs and different approaches to look at the counter to the counter, and how do we make things more resilient that way, right? Beyond just the detection of the deepfakes or using it for deepfakes.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you about the ethics question, which, as you mentioned, Terminator. From what I understand, of course, DoD doctrine insists that there will always be a human in the loop with lethal force. I've also heard about out of the loop autonomy in the sense that AI could be used purely for defensive purposes, perhaps as an interceptor, something like that to save lives, or counter drone. Have you heard anything about out of the loop AI? What's your sense of that kind of autonomy? Is there space for it at all, and to be safe?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question you pose, Kris. I think that there are some thoughts that we have to mature around that space, but I always kind of throw out the unintended usage, right? So AI is great and will advance us, but from the military side, we always think about the unintended usages of that, right? And for the same context you talked about, human out of the loop or for defensive purposes, that could easily be repurposed for other unintended reasons, as well as, again, if we don't protect or harden that, right, that becomes a vulnerability that could be taken over. And so we are very deliberate in that. The DoD has a process around that. My understanding is that the Navy is the only service that's actually gone through and piloted something around the human in the loop, or I'm not going to say out of the loop, but the human in the loop scenarios of how the DoD's put safeguards in there, and is the only services that actually have gone through that so far. I think we're all learning from that, and we're learning from our sister service colleagues around that. But the Army has not done that. But I think we're trying to be a little bit more deliberate and thinking about the unintended uses or unintended consequences of that.
Well, excellent. I love how you talked about the art and the science, because, of course, the U.S. doctrine is very heavy on ethics, as you talked about, but a potential adversary may not care. So someone like you has to think about, how does our service prepare to fight an army of robots?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, so admittedly, if we think about our peer threat there, or our pacing threat, right, they don't have the same constraints. They don't have the same uh, really perspectives around ethics at all. And so I think that's why we have to mobilize as an all of the US and all of more than just government, right? All of government and industry to really handle this problem and our pacing threat, and think of more creative approaches around that. The thing that I will say about China is that they're very dogmatic in a lot of things: research, discipline, doctrine, all of those things. But the one advantage, or one of the many advantages I think the US has, is our creativity and ingenuity, which is the opposite of dogma, right? And so I think, again, the all of industry, all of government approach together working against our pacing threat has got to be our differentiator against our enemy.
Thank you, Mr. Youngvang, powerhouse cyber IT, serious weapons developer from the Pentagon, talking to Warrior. We're grateful. We're honored. Thanks for your time, sir. Our viewers really want to hear from you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kris, for your time.
Sure.